Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The orchids were behaving themselves that Tuesday morning, which was more than I could say for the woman in the front room. I'd been at my desk in the office, working through a stack of expense reports that Wolfe had been ignoring since the previous Thursday, when the doorbell rang at 20 minutes past 10. Fritz answered it, as Fritz answers everything that requires opening a door before noon, and came back to tell me there was a woman asking to see Nero Wolfe on a matter of some urgency. "Does she have a name?" I asked. "Mrs. Elspeth Harrow," Fritz said, with that particular inflection he reserves for visitors he has already decided are trouble. Fritz has an instinct for these things. In 12 years I've never known him to be wrong. I told him to put her in the front room, and went upstairs to interrupt Wolfe's morning ritual. He was in the plant rooms on the roof, which is where he goes every day from 9 to 11, and again from 4 to 6, communing with his 10,000 orchids in a manner that suggests he finds their company more stimulating than most people's. I pressed the button on the house phone and waited. Yes. His voice came through the speaker like a man being asked to relocate a continent. "Woman downstairs, Elspeth Harrow, says it's urgent." Urgent is a word people use when they wish to transfer their anxiety to others. "Tell her I'm engaged. She's wearing a black dress that cost more than my monthly salary, and she's carrying a rosewood box about the size of a large encyclopedia that she won't put down. She held onto it the whole time Fritz tried to take her coat." A pause. Wolfe is not immune to the well-placed detail. "Tell her I'll be down at 11. I went back downstairs and delivered this news to Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, who received it with the controlled displeasure of a woman accustomed to being made to wait, and furious about it. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, with silver hair pinned severely back, a long face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more formidable, and eyes the color of good cognac, brown with a faint amber fire behind them. The rosewood box sat in her lap like a second client. I introduced myself, offered coffee, and got a look that suggested I had proposed something mildly offensive. I poured myself a cup and sat across from her. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, after studying me for a moment with the thoroughness of someone appraising a used car. "I was told Nero Wolfe is the finest private investigator in New York, possibly in the country." "I wouldn't argue with that," I said. "I was also told he is extraordinarily difficult." "That's accurate too. The two facts are not unrelated." She made a sound that might have been a laugh in a more relaxed person. "My nephew told me to expect a circus." "Your nephew underestimates us. We're more of a chamber orchestra, controlled, precise, occasionally brilliant." This time it was definitely a laugh. Small, reluctant, but genuine. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders, though the grip on the rosewood box didn't loosen by a fraction. At 11 o'clock precisely, I heard the elevator descend. Wolfe refuses to use the stairs except in emergencies, which he defines as situations in which the elevator itself is on fire. And then, the familiar heavy tread moving down the hall. He came through the office door, all 268 pounds of him, moving with the particular deliberate grace of a large man who has made peace with his dimensions. He was wearing his best yellow smock, which meant he'd changed before coming down, which meant he was more interested in this than he was willing to admit. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, settling into the reinforced chair behind his desk with the careful precision of a ship finding its moorings. "I am Nero Wolfe. Forgive me for keeping you. My morning schedule is inviolable, but I endeavor to minimize the inconvenience." "You kept me waiting 37 minutes, she said. "I did. Would you like more coffee?" She blinked. Then she set the rosewood box on the edge of his desk and folded her hands in her lap. "Mr. Wolfe, 3 weeks ago my brother died. I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't be. We hadn't spoken in 11 years. She said it without heat, as a simple meteorological fact. His name was Cornelius Ashford Harrow. He was 71 years old, and he died of what the police are calling natural causes. A heart attack, in his study, at approximately 2 in the morning on the 14th of this month. Wolfe's eyes were at their most half-lidded, which is when he's most alert. And you believe otherwise. I believe he was murdered. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed many times, and still aren't sure they'll be believed. And I believe the evidence is in this box. I had my notebook out. Wolfe hadn't told me to take notes, but 11 years of working with the man have given me a reasonable sense of when a case has begun. Before you continue, Wolfe said, I should tell you my fee is substantial. My methods are my own, and I do not leave this house to pursue investigations. My associate, Mr. Goodwin, will conduct whatever physical inquiries are necessary. If these terms are agreeable, proceed. If not, there are other detectives in New York who will be happy to disappoint you for considerably less money. Mrs. Harrow looked at him steadily. My brother's estate is valued at approximately $14 million. I am one of 3 surviving heirs. I am prepared to be generous. Then tell me about your brother. She did. It took the better part of an hour, and over the course of it, Fritz brought in beer for Wolfe. 2 bottles, his standard morning allotment, and I filled 4 pages of my notebook. The picture that emerged was not a comfortable one. Cornelius Harrow had been, by any measure, a difficult man. He'd built his fortune in the 1970s and 80s through a series of acquisitions in the specialty publishing business. Art books, limited editions, antiquarian reprints, and had leveraged that into a broader media concern that had since contracted significantly, leaving him wealthy but no longer powerful, which Elspeth described as having made him considerably worse to deal with. He'd been married twice, divorced twice, and had 1 son from the first marriage, a man named Philip, 42 years old, currently living in his father's house in the West 70s while the estate was sorted out. Philip and Cornelius were not close, Elspeth said. Philip has expensive tastes and limited income. He's been waiting for this inheritance for years. He made no particular secret of it. You mentioned 3 heirs, I said. Yes, myself, Philip, and a woman named Vera Cosgrove. She was Cornelius's personal assistant for the last 6 years. He amended his will 14 months ago to include her as a beneficiary, 1/3 of the estate. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape. I see, Wolfe said. And the other parties, Philip and Miss Cosgrove, their reactions to the death? Philip was in the house when it happened, apparently. He told the police he heard nothing. Vera Cosgrove was at her own apartment, also apparently. Neither has been troubled by the police beyond a routine conversation. She touched the edge of the rosewood box. Mr. Wolfe, my brother was a difficult man, but he was not a man who left things unattended. He was meticulous. He kept records of everything. Correspondence, financial notes, personal observations. He called it his ledger of human nature, which sounds more poetic than it was. It was simply a record of anything he thought might be important someday. And this box? Wolfe asked. Cornelius sent it to me 3 weeks before he died. No letter, no explanation. Just the box, by private courier, with my name on it, and a note that said, in case of events. The box has a combination lock. I didn't know the combination. I tried his birth date, his anniversary, his mother's birth date. Nothing worked. How did you open it? I asked. A faint, dry smile. I am not entirely without resources, Mr. Goodwin. I found a locksmith willing to work discreetly. She opened the box and turned it to face us. Inside, resting on a bed of dark green felt, were 3 things: a small leather-bound notebook, a photograph, and what appeared to be a key on a plain brass ring. Wolfe looked at the contents without touching them. May I? That's why I'm here. He took the notebook first, opening it with the deliberate care he applies to anything he considers potentially valuable. I watched his face, which is a study in controlled revelation at the best of times. He read for perhaps 4 minutes, turning pages slowly. Then he set it down. The photograph, he said. It showed 3 people standing in front of what appeared to be the entrance to a hotel or private club. heavy brass doors, a carved stone arch. 2 men and a woman. One of the men was older, silver-haired, with the rigid posture of someone who has never entirely abandoned military bearing. The other was younger, perhaps 35, with a narrow face and an expression of concentrated attention. The woman stood between them, caught in the act of turning away from the camera, so that her face was a 3/4 profile, visible, but not fully. On the back of the photograph, in a small, cramped hand, Gr. DC, and the matter of the Aldecott account. November. No year, no further identification. The key? Wolfe asked. I don't know what it opens. I've looked at it for 3 weeks, and I have no idea. Wolfe set the key down with a small, precise click. He leaned back, laced his fingers over his enormous stomach, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. I've seen this posture many times. It means something has hooked him. Mrs. Harrow, he said, the notebook contains entries your brother made over what appears to be a period of several months. The final entry is dated the 9th of this month, 5 days before his death. In it, he writes, and I am paraphrasing, that he has confirmed what he suspected, that the matter is more serious than he initially believed, and that he has secured the relevant documentation in a place known only to himself. Wolfe paused. He does not specify the nature of the matter, the identity of the parties involved, or the location of this documentation. He is, as you say, meticulous, but he is meticulous about what he chooses to record, not merely how. Can you find out what he knew? Elspeth asked. There was nothing theatrical about the question. It was the straightforward inquiry of a woman who had been carrying a weight for 3 weeks and wanted to know if someone else could help her carry it. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Then, Archie. Yes? Please ask Fritz to prepare a light lunch. Mrs. Harrow will be joining me. You will tell me everything you know about the Aldecott account. The look on her face told me she'd never heard of it. That was, as it turned out, the first of many complications. After lunch, during which Wolfe extracted another 90 minutes of background information while consuming a cold poached salmon with cucumber sauce that Fritz had assembled on approximately 45 minutes' notice, because Fritz is a genius, and Wolfe exploits this shamelessly. I walked Mrs. Harrow to the door, and took her number, and a retainer check that made me whistle softly at the figures. Back in the office, Wolfe was examining the photograph again, holding it at the angle of a man reading fine print in bad light. What do you make of it? I asked. I make very little of it yet, which is the appropriate epistemic position at the beginning of an investigation. He set it down. The man on the left, the older one, has a particular way of standing that suggests decades of deliberate self-presentation. The posture of a man who has always been watched and has never entirely objected to it. The younger man is looking at something outside the frame. Not the camera, not the woman. Something specific to the left. And the woman? Turning away. He folded his hands. Deliberately or accidentally, I cannot say, but the photograph was kept. That implies the moment was significant. Gr. and DC, I said. Initials. Quite. You will obtain a full list of Cornelius Harrow's professional associates, business partners, and personal contacts, with particular attention to anyone whose initials might correspond. And the Aldecott account? Mrs. Harrow has no knowledge of it. That is interesting. A man who kept records of everything chose not to record this particular matter in any document his sister might encounter. He sent her the box without explanation. He expected her to need it, but not to understand it. Wolfe's eyes moved to the rosewood box, still sitting on the corner of his desk. He was protecting her from something, Archie. Or protecting someone from her. I am not yet certain which. I put my notebook away and looked at the key. Brass, plain, approximately the size of a safe deposit key, but with a slightly different tooth pattern. I'll start with Philip Harrow, I said. The son. Yes, and Miss Cosgrove. I want observations, Archie. not summaries. I want to know how they move, what they choose to look at, whether they are the sort of people who answer questions or the sort who manage them. And if neither of them knows anything about an Aldecott account? Wolfe picked up his book from the corner of the desk. He is always reading, the way other men are always breathing, and settled into it with the finality of a drawbridge going up. Then we will find someone who does, he said, and said nothing else until dinner time. I sat for a moment, looking at the photograph, the notebook, and the key, laid out on the green felt of the rosewood box, like 3 words of a sentence in a language I hadn't learned yet. Outside, New York was doing what New York always does, moving, shouting, ignoring itself at great volume. In here, the clock on the mantelpiece ticked, Fritz rattled something distant in the kitchen, and Nero Wolfe turned a page. The case of the silent heirloom had officially begun. The West 70s address, where Philip Harrow was currently residing, his late father's house, turned out to be one of those narrow limestone brownstones that Manhattan produces in batches every 30 years or so, each generation convinced they've discovered the city's best ratio of elegance to square footage. This one was 4 stories, impeccably maintained, with a dark green door and brass fittings that had been polished recently enough to suggest either genuine care or deliberate impression management. I rang at 2:30 on Wednesday afternoon, and was answered by a young man who was not, I was fairly sure, a member of the household staff. He was perhaps 40, wearing expensive casual clothes in the particular combination that signals someone trying to look like they're not trying. Dark trousers, an open collar, loafers that cost more than a used sedan. He had a long, narrow face, the same face, I realized, as the younger man in the photograph, and the kind of eyes that are perpetually evaluating something. "Mr. Harrow?" I said. "That's right." He looked at my card with the controlled interest of someone who has been expecting some version of this visit for a while. "Nero Wolfe. I've heard of him." He handed the card back. "Most people have," I said. "I'm Archie Goodwin. I wonder if you could spare 20 minutes. He stepped back and let me in. The interior was exactly what the exterior promised. High ceilings, dark wood, the smell of old money and recent cleaning. The furniture was serious, not antique in the ostentatious sense, but old in a way that implies continuity of ownership rather than decoration. Family things, which is different. He took me into a sitting room on the ground floor and didn't offer me anything, which told me something. Not necessarily something damning. Some people simply don't think to offer. But it went in the notebook. "You're here about my father," he said. "Your mother hired Mr. Wolfe." "My aunt." He said it without particular emphasis, but I noted the correction. "What does Elspeth think happened?" "She has questions about the circumstances of your father's death, as do we, on her behalf." Philip Harrow leaned back in his chair, a fine wing chair, probably Victorian, probably original to the house, and studied the middle distance for a moment. He had the bearing of a man who has spent considerable time preparing answers to questions he was certain would eventually be asked. "The police were satisfied," he said. "Heart attack. My father had a history of cardiac episodes. His cardiologist will confirm it." "Can you tell me about the night of the 14th? "I've told the police. Humor me, I'm a slower learner." He looked at me for a beat, decided this was acceptable, and gave me the story. He'd been in the house. He'd been living there for the past month, at his father's invitation, which he described as an attempt at rapprochement, in a tone that suggested he wasn't sure the word was accurate. He'd gone to bed at 11. He hadn't heard anything. He'd found his father the next morning at roughly 7:30, sitting in the study chair with a book in his lap, as if he'd simply stopped. "Was that typical?" I asked. "Your father reading in the study that late?" "He was a night person. He kept odd hours. He slept badly." A pause. "He always had." "And Vera Cosgrove, she wasn't in the house that night?" Something changed in his face. It was small, a slight recalibration around the eyes, a fractional tightening at the corners, but it was there. "Vera has her own apartment," he said. "She didn't live here." But she was here regularly. She was his assistant, yes. How regularly? Most days, sometimes evenings when they were working on something. He kept his voice level, but the tightening had moved to his jaw. Why are you asking about Vera? She's a beneficiary, it's routine. 1/3 of the estate. He said it with a precision that told me he had said it to himself many times, in the same tone, arriving at the same destination. Yes, I know. Did you know before the will was read? I knew he'd revised the will. He didn't tell me the specifics. A beat. Which was typical. Were you surprised by the amount? Philip Harrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Mr. Goodwin, my father was a man who expressed affection through financial instruments. It was how he operated. When he wanted to reward someone, he included them in documents. When he wanted to punish someone, he excluded them. Vera was important to him. I don't know in what capacity exactly. I've decided that's not my business. He said the last sentence with the careful firmness of someone who has talked himself into this position fairly recently, and is still checking its integrity. Did you like her? I asked. I barely know her. Did you like her? I asked again. He looked at me sharply. Then he said more quietly, No, I didn't particularly like her. She was competent, and she was attentive to my father, and she was in my father's house more often than I was, despite the fact that I am his son. So no, Mr. Goodwin, I did not particularly like Vera Cosgrove. I wrote that down. He watched me write it and didn't object. One last thing, I said. Did your father ever mention something called the Aldecott account? The response was immediate, and I was fairly certain genuine. A small frown, eyes going slightly unfocused in the manner of someone running a quick interior search. No, he said. What is that? We're not sure yet. Thank you for your time, Mr. Harrow. He showed me out himself, which people often don't, and stood in the doorway for a moment as I went down the steps. When I glanced back at the street, he was still there, watching. Vera Cosgrove lived in a third-floor apartment on the east side, in one of those post-war buildings that look functional and anonymous from the street, but turn out to have good bones and surprisingly decent light. She buzzed me up promptly when I rang, which told me either she had nothing to hide, or she'd decided that appearing cooperative was the best current strategy. It can be hard to tell the difference at first. She answered the door in dark trousers and a gray sweater, her hair back, a coffee mug in her hand. She was perhaps 38, with a round, open face that managed to be both pleasant and reserved, the face of someone who has learned to give people just enough warmth to keep them comfortable without actually letting them in. Medium height, composed posture, and eyes that were sharper than her expression. Mr. Goodwin, she said, as if she'd been expecting me specifically. Maybe she had. Please come in. The apartment was neat and personal. Books on the shelves, real ones, with cracked spines and paper bookmarks. A desk with an organized surface. A framed print on the wall that I put as Flemish, 17th century, not a reproduction. She poured me coffee before I could decline it, which I noticed. I heard Elspeth hired a detective, she said, settling into the chair across from me. Word travels. Philip called me this morning. He said someone would probably come. And how do you feel about that? About what? Someone coming. She looked at me with the mild patience of someone who is used to questions she finds slightly beneath her actual level. I feel fine about it. I didn't do anything, Mr. Goodwin. I was at home when Cornelius died. I can show you the cab receipt from when I left. I took a cab home at 9:15. My neighbor can confirm I was in all night. I have no objection to being investigated. You anticipated being investigated. Of course. I'm in the will for a significant amount, and I'm not a family member, and I was close to the man who died. If I weren't being investigated, someone would be doing their job badly. She said all of this with perfect equanimity, as if discussing someone else's situation. How close? I asked. We were friends. A pause. And professional partners. He relied on me. I was good at my job. What did your job involve? Everything. His schedule, his correspondence, his business contacts. He was still consulting for several of the companies he'd sold stakes in. Nothing large, but ongoing relationships that needed management. I handled the communication. I organized his files. She paused again. I also read to him, in the evenings sometimes. His eyes had been troubling him for the past year. He didn't like to admit it. There was something in her voice when she said that. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something more like the particular tenderness of someone who has been trusted with a person's private vulnerabilities and is careful about where she puts that trust now. Miss Cosgrove, I said, did you know he was revising his will to include you? He told me when it was done, not before. Were you surprised? She considered this with what seemed like genuine care. I was moved, she said finally, and uncomfortable. I told him it wasn't necessary. What did he say? He said it was precisely necessary. She looked at her coffee mug for a moment. He said there were things he hadn't done correctly, and he intended to do this one correctly. I don't know what he meant by that. He could be oblique. Did he seem worried in the weeks before he died? The question produced a fractional pause, smaller than Philip's. Better managed, but present. He was distracted, she said. He'd been corresponding with someone. I don't know who. He handled it himself, which was unusual. He kept a notebook he didn't show me. He made calls from his mobile rather than the house phone, which, she added, was very unusual. He hated mobile phones. When did this start? Approximately 6 weeks before he died. 6 weeks. I put that against Elspeth's timeline for receiving the rosewood box. 3 weeks before his death. Which meant whatever had disturbed Cornelius Harrow had started roughly 3 weeks before he sent his sister the box, and continued until the end. Miss Cosgrove, does the name Aldecott mean anything to you? An account, possibly. Something financial. She put her coffee mug down on the side table with great care. Where did you hear that? She said. It came up in connection with your employer. She looked at me steadily for a long moment. Long enough that I had time to count 4 seconds, which in a conversation like this is substantial. No, she said at last, it doesn't mean anything to me. I have been in this business long enough to know the difference between someone who doesn't know something and someone who doesn't know something and is very grateful for that fact. Vera Cosgrove knew the Aldecott name. She wasn't telling me where from, and she was concerned, not frightened, not guilty, but concerned, in the way someone is concerned when a dangerous object they've been watching from a safe distance suddenly moves. I thanked her, gave her my card, and left. On the street, I stood for a moment and wrote in my notebook. VC, knows the name, won't say how, not relieved by question, worried by it. Difference, doesn't think she's in danger, thinks someone else might be. I wasn't sure where I'd gotten that last part, but I wrote it down anyway, because Wolfe has occasionally told me that my instincts are more reliable than my self-assessments, and I've learned to trust him on that, even when I find it irritating. I flagged a cab back to the brownstone. Wolfe was in the plant rooms when I got back. I sat at my desk, made a second set of notes from the day's conversations, and spent an hour on the telephone, making inquiries about something I hadn't told Wolfe yet, because I wasn't sure it was relevant. The key in the rosewood box was bothering me. It wasn't a safe deposit key. I'd looked at those enough to know the difference, but it was close. The tooth pattern was specific in a way that suggested purpose rather than generality. I'd taken a photograph of it and sent it to a contact of mine who deals in security hardware, asking if she could identify the type. She called back at 6. It's a Weissman cabinet lock, she said. Old system. They stopped making them in the mid-90s. Used in specialty storage applications, archives, private libraries, that kind of thing. The cabinets were custom-built, usually. Whoever owned it had it made to order. Any way to trace who owned the cabinet? Weissman's been out of business for 20 years, but the cabinets were sold through authorized dealers, and a few of the dealers kept records. I can make some calls if you want. I said yes, and gave her my number. When Wolfe came down at 6 o'clock, I reported the day's interviews in detail. He listened from his chair with his eyes closed, which is his preferred mode of receiving information. He claims visual stimulation interferes with his processing, and since he is approximately always right about these things, I've stopped arguing. When I finished, he opened his eyes. Miss Cosgrove recognized the name, he said. Instantly. She buried it well, but not instantly enough. And Philip Harrow did not. Genuinely not, I think. Different kind of blank. Archie. The notebook your client's brother kept contains a reference, indirect but clear once you know to look for it, to a financial arrangement involving a third party that Cornelius Harrow believed to be fraudulent. He uses the word arrangement and the phrase funds displaced from their origin. He does not name anyone except by initials. He paused. Gr. Same initials as the photograph. Quite. So we need to find Gr. We need to find several things. Gr. We need to know what the Aldecott account was, and whether it still exists in any form. We need to know why Cornelius Harrow was suddenly conducting private correspondence 6 weeks before his death. And we need to understand why a man who trusted his assistant with everything chose to handle one particular matter entirely himself. I looked at my notes. Because he didn't want her involved, I said. He was protecting her. Wolfe looked at me with that expression he gets when I have said something he was about to say, and he is both pleased I got there and mildly annoyed I got there first. That, he said, is exactly the question. From what? And why her rather than himself? Fritz appeared in the doorway to announce dinner, which on that evening was a blanquette de veau that he had been constructing since noon, and which smelled like an argument for civilization. Wolfe rose. Tomorrow, he said, I think we will need more people in this room. He was already thinking about who to invite. I was already thinking about who might not want to come. The medical examiner's report arrived Thursday morning, delivered by a contact of mine at the department, who owed me 3 favors, and was clearly glad to be down to 2. I read it at my desk, before Wolfe came downstairs. The language was medical and precise, and arrived at conclusions I found interesting, not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it mentioned in passing and then set aside. Cornelius Harrow had indeed died of cardiac arrest. His heart had stopped. What was mentioned, briefly, in a subordinate clause that carried the particular tone of something noted and then deliberately underweighted, was the presence of elevated potassium levels in the blood. Hyperkalemia, the report called it, and noted it as consistent with the cardiac event itself. Potassium levels rise after death, and in a man with pre-existing heart disease, the reading was within the range of explainable. Cause of death? Natural. Case closed. I stared at that subordinate clause for a while. When Wolfe came down at 11, he found me still at my desk, and the report on the corner of his blotter. You've read it, he said. The potassium. He lowered himself into his chair. Yes. Elevated potassium can cause cardiac arrest, I said. In someone with an existing heart condition, an acute spike could look exactly like a natural event. It can. He folded his hands. And elevated potassium levels in a body are difficult to distinguish post-mortem from the natural process of decomposition. The medical examiner noted it and found it consistent with the overall picture. Wrong to do so. He was, perhaps, not as curious as he might have been. Potassium chloride, I said, is one vehicle. There are others. He picked up the report, read the relevant passage, set it down. It proves nothing, Archie. It is suggestive. It is the kind of suggestion that a man like Cornelius Harrow, anticipating it, might have tried to leave a record of. Which is why he sent the box. Which is why he sent the box. Wolfe reached for his first beer of the morning. In case of events, he wrote, he expected something to happen. He prepared for it, but he did not prevent it. A pause. Either because he underestimated the timeline, or because he could not. I thought about that. He thought he had more time. He thought he had protected himself by creating the record. He did not consider that protecting himself and protecting the record were separate problems. Outside, the city moved through its Thursday business. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. I could hear Fritz in the kitchen, beginning the preparations for lunch. Something with stock, from the smell of it. Something that would require patience. "I have an appointment with Cornelius Harrow's physician," I said. 2:00. "Good. I want to know the exact nature and extent of his cardiac history. Not the summary, the specifics. When the episodes occurred, how they were managed, whether anyone outside immediate family and medical staff had access to his treatment records." "You think someone knew enough about his condition to calibrate this?" "I think that whoever did this, if anyone did this, was careful and knowledgeable. That limits the field." He opened his book. "There is also the question of the document Cornelius claimed to have secured. He writes of it in the notebook as the relevant documentation. We have the notebook, the photograph, and the key. The key presumably opens whatever contains the documentation. We don't know where the cabinet is. My contact is working on tracing the Weissman lock system." "Good." He turned a page without looking at it. "Archie." "Yes?" "I would also like you to find out everything you can about a company or financial entity called Aldecott. Not through official channels first, through people who would know, without being asked officially." "You mean people who traffic in the kind of information that doesn't appear in public filings?" "I mean," he said, with the mild precision of a man choosing words carefully, "that I would like you to ask Saul." Saul Panzer occupies a category that resists easy description. He is the best freelance operative in New York, possibly on the eastern seaboard, and he is employed by Wolfe whenever the situation exceeds my capacity for simultaneous investigation, which happens occasionally. He is a small, unremarkable-looking man with a forgettable face and an extraordinary mind. And he knows more about the financial underside of Manhattan than 3 investigative journalists combined. I called him before I left for the doctor's office, gave him the name Aldecott and the context, and he said he'd have something by evening. Dr. Marcus Fenwick ran a practice on Park Avenue, in one of those medical offices that functions as a deliberate signal of clientele. Heavy furniture, muted colors, staff who speak quietly and move with the efficiency of people who understand that their patients' time is valuable. He was a trim, careful man of about 60, with the measured affect of someone who has spent decades delivering difficult information without drama. He received me in his private office, having already received a call from Mrs. Harrow authorizing him to speak to me, and answered my questions with the cooperation of a man who is glad, in retrospect, to be more careful about a case he may have been insufficiently careful about. "Cornelius had what we call hypertrophic cardiomyopathy," he said, "an inherited structural condition. The heart muscle is thickened, which impairs function and creates susceptibility to arrhythmias. He'd had 2 significant episodes in the past 8 years, one in 2019, one in 2022, both resolved with medication adjustment. He was on a stable protocol. Was there any reason to expect a fatal event? There is always a baseline risk with his condition. But his most recent tests, 6 weeks ago, showed no deterioration. He was in reasonable condition for his age and diagnosis. I would not have predicted this." He paused. "I find myself, in retrospect, wishing I had looked more carefully." "At the potassium levels?" He looked at me with the slight shift of a man who has been hoping and dreading this question in roughly equal measure. "The levels were elevated," he said, "within an explainable range, in the context of his cardiac history and the post-mortem interval. The medical examiner's conclusion was defensible. But I reviewed the report again last week, after Elspeth Harrow contacted me. In the context of someone raising the question of foul play, the levels are more interesting than I initially found them." "Could they have been induced?" He was quiet for a moment. "Certain medications, in overdose, could achieve an acute potassium spike that would trigger cardiac arrest in someone with his condition. If administered correctly, the window between administration and event could be quite narrow. Post-mortem, in someone with a documented cardiac history, the presentation would be very difficult to distinguish from a natural event. Difficult, I said, but not impossible. With the right testing, targeted specifically at that question, perhaps not impossible. But the standard examination didn't include that testing, because there was no initial reason to suspect it. Is there any way to know now? Could additional testing be requested? The body was cremated, he said, 10 days ago. I sat with that for a moment. Convenient, I said. Perhaps. He looked uncomfortable. Or simply what the family arranged. I can't assign meaning to it. Who arranged the cremation? I believe, and you would want to verify this, that it was handled by the estate. Philip Harrow signed the authorization. I thanked the doctor, gave him my card, and left. On the way back uptown in the cab, I made notes and thought about Philip Harrow, who had signed the authorization for cremation, who had found his father's body at 7:30 in the morning, who had been in the house all night and heard nothing, who disliked Vera Cosgrove with a controlled intensity that suggested long acquaintance with the feeling, who had known about the revised will, and who, when I'd asked about the Aldecott account, had produced a blank so clean and immediate that I'd initially read it as genuine. I thought about it more carefully now. It had been immediate. That was the thing. The question had barely landed before the blank expression arrived. And in my experience, genuine blankness at an unfamiliar name takes a half-second of processing, a small interior search before the face settles into not knowing. Philip's blank had been already prepared. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you could argue both ways all night and still not be certain. But I wrote it down. When I got back to the brownstone, Saul was already there, sitting in the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, and eating one of Fritz's cheese straws with the contentment of a man who has spent the afternoon being useful. Wolfe was in his chair, and the atmosphere in the room had the particular quality it gets when two people have been talking about something interesting and are waiting for the third to arrive. "Archie," Wolfe said, "sit down." I sat. Saul gave me a nod that meant he'd found something. "The Aldecott account," Wolfe said, "is not a bank account in the conventional sense. It is, or was, a private investment vehicle. A limited partnership, registered in Delaware, nominally dissolved in 2018. It was established in 2009 and operated for approximately 9 years. Its stated purpose was specialty media investment, which, given Cornelius Harrow's professional background, would have been unremarkable on its face." "On its face," I said. Saul has learned that the Aldecott partnership was the subject of an informal inquiry by the SEC in 2017. The inquiry was closed without action. The inquiry was closed because the principal documentation that had triggered it, a complaint filed by an anonymous party, was subsequently withdrawn. "Who filed the complaint?" Wolfe looked at me steadily. "The complaint was filed anonymously, but the inquiry records, which Saul obtained through means I will not specify, indicate that the SEC investigator at the time believed the source to be someone with direct knowledge of the partnership's operations. A partner, possibly," Wolfe said, "or an observer, someone who knew what was happening without necessarily participating, which would explain why the SEC complaint was filed and then withdrawn. The observer had second thoughts, or was persuaded to have them." "Quite." He looked at the photograph for another moment. "We need to know who DC is, and we need to know what relationship, if any, either Rennick or DC had with the people currently positioned to benefit from Cornelius Harrow's death." I looked at my notes. Philip, Vera. Yes. He turned to look at the clock. "Tomorrow morning, Archie, I would like you to drive to Connecticut." I had been expecting this. "Gerald Rennick," I said. If Cornelius Harrow believed the Aldecott arrangement was fraudulent, and if he believed he had been wronged by it, or knew of someone who had been, then Rennick is the man who can tell us what Harrow knew. Whether he will is a separate question. "People in Connecticut are less forthcoming than people in the city," I said. "More time to think, Less ambient pressure. Then you will apply your own ambient pressure, Wolfe said placidly. You are not without resources in that department. I conceded the point. We had dinner, seared duck with a cherry reduction, preceded by a soup that had taken Fritz 3 hours and was worth every minute. And afterward I sat in my room and reviewed everything I had so far. A dead man who had known something, and tried to leave a record of it. A son with prepared ignorance. An assistant who recognized a name, and was frightened by the recognition. A retired financier in Connecticut, with initials that matched a photograph. A cremated body with elevated potassium that could no longer be tested. A key to a cabinet we hadn't found yet. And somewhere in all of it, a second person, DC, who might be the center of gravity for everything else. I turned out the light at midnight, which is unusual for me. I was too busy thinking to sleep. I slept anyway. That's a professional skill too. Wolfe's interrogations are theatrical, only in the sense that all serious intellectual performances are theatrical. Not by design, but by consequence. He doesn't arrange the furniture or adjust the lighting. He simply sits in his chair, enormous and still, and asks questions in a tone of mild academic curiosity. And people answer him with more honesty than they intended to bring. It's a function of atmosphere. His office, with its books and globes, and the sturdy permanence of the desk, and the smell of whatever Fritz has been cooking, creates a context in which evasion feels somehow structurally unsound, like lying inside a cathedral. He had asked me to arrange for both Philip Harrow and Vera Cosgrove to come on Friday afternoon, separately, with 2 hours between them. He hadn't told me why he wanted them separately. He rarely explains tactical decisions in advance, but I suspected he was planning to compare the seams of their stories, and was less interested in the stories themselves than in whether the seams matched. Philip Harrow arrived at 2 o'clock in a dark suit that suggested he'd come from somewhere that required a dark suit, and hadn't bothered to change, which told me something about how he wanted to present himself. A man of affairs, not a man waiting around to be summoned. He took the red leather chair, the good chair, the one clients usually get, and looked around the office with the composed attention of someone who has been told to expect a circus and is reserving judgment. Wolfe greeted him with the same formality he extends to everyone, total and entirely impersonal. Mr. Harrow, thank you for coming. I should tell you that this conversation is being conducted on behalf of your aunt, who has retained me to investigate the circumstances of your father's death. You're under no obligation to speak to me, and I won't pretend otherwise. I understand, Philip said. I don't object. Excellent. Then I'll begin with a simple question. Did your father ever discuss with you the Aldecott Limited Partnership? If I hadn't been watching for it, I might have missed it again. There it was, that immediate settling of the face into blankness, arriving slightly too quickly. No, he said. He didn't. He was involved with it professionally, approximately 2009 through 2018. My father had many professional involvements. He didn't discuss them all with me. Philip kept his voice level and his hands still, which most people can't do simultaneously when they're managing a lie. The partnership was controlled by a man named Gerald Rennick, Wolfe said. Were you acquainted with Rennick? The name is familiar. He may have attended some of my father's professional events over the years. I met many people at those events. You may have met him, Wolfe repeated, as if tasting the construction. Mr. Harrow, I am going to describe a photograph to you. 2 men and a woman, standing in front of what appears to be a private club entrance. One man is older, silver-haired, with a military bearing. The other is younger, with a narrow face, approximately 35 at the time the photograph was taken. The woman is turned partly away from the camera. Philip said nothing. He was very still. The photograph was kept by your father, Wolfe continued, and was sent to your aunt in a locked box, along with other materials your father considered significant. The older man in the photograph corresponds to the description I have of Gerald Rennick. The younger man has initials DC, derived from a notation on the back. He paused. The younger man resembles you. The stillness intensified. It was the stillness of someone deciding what they can afford. "That's an interesting observation," Philip said finally. "DC," I said from my desk. "Initials that don't match Philip Harrow. What did you go by before?" The faintest possible reaction. Then, "My mother's name," he said. "Before she remarried. She was Diane Castellano. My legal name through college was Philip Castellano." A pause. "I took my father's name at 29 when we—" He stopped. "When we reconciled. Briefly." Wolfe let that sit for a moment. "You knew Gerald Rennick," Wolfe said. It was no longer a question. "Yes." The monosyllable carried the weight of something being finally put down. "I knew Gerald Rennick. I worked with him for a period, after college, before I found my own footing professionally. He was a contact of my father's, and he offered me a position, junior level, operational support for the fund management. The Aldecott Fund. Among others, yes. And during your time there, did you observe anything that concerned you?" Philip Harrow looked at Wolfe directly for the first time since the conversation had turned serious. "What I observed," he said, "is something I discussed with the SEC in 2017, under conditions of anonymity. I withdrew my statement because I was pressured to, and because I was not in a position at the time to deal with the consequences of not withdrawing it." "Who pressured you?" "Rennick, through intermediaries. He made it clear that if I persisted, certain information about my own involvement, which was minimal, but not absent, would become visible." He looked at his hands. "I was younger. I made a choice I'm not proud of." "Your father knew what you had done," Wolfe said, "both the original observation and the withdrawal." "He found out. Later. It was one of the reasons we didn't speak for 11 years. The room was quiet. "When did you and your father reconcile?" Wolfe asked. "He called me 8 weeks ago. Asked me to come and stay for a while." Philip looked up. "He said there was something he wanted to tell me. Something he'd worked out and needed to close properly. He didn't specify what it was, but I assumed it had something to do with Rennick, with the Aldecott matter. He seemed energized in a way I hadn't seen in years, like a man settling accounts." "And in the weeks you were there, he didn't tell you what he'd found?" "He said he was waiting for confirmation of one thing. After that he would tell me everything." His voice was controlled. He never got to it. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Harrow, one more question. The cremation authorization, you signed it 10 days after your father's death." "Yes. The estate lawyer indicated it was standard practice to proceed." "Who recommended the lawyer?" A pause. "Vera," he said. "Vera Cosgrove had been managing my father's legal and administrative relationships. She recommended the firm." He left that there, like an object set down carefully on a table, equidistant from all sides. After Philip had gone, I brought in the tray with Wolfe's 4 o'clock beer and sat across from him. "Well," I said. "DC is Philip Castellano Harrow," Wolfe said. "He witnessed enough of the Aldecott operations to file a complaint. He withdrew it under duress. His father discovered this, and it caused an 11-year estrangement. 8 weeks ago, Cornelius contacted him. Approximately the same time, note, that Cornelius began conducting private correspondence and behaving secretively, and told him he had found something and wanted to close it properly. And then Cornelius died," I said. "And Philip signed the cremation authorization on Vera's lawyer's recommendation." "Yes." He picked up his beer. "Which gives us at minimum 2 possibilities. Either Philip Harrow colluded in his father's death, having decided that the inheritance was more expedient than whatever truth his father was about to expose. Or Philip Harrow is precisely what he appears to be, a compromised man trying to find his way back to his father. And the cremation authorization was simply an administrative decision he made on bad advice. And Vera's lawyer recommendation? Maybe coincidence, maybe management." He set the glass down. "Miss Cosgrove arrives at 4. Vera Cosgrove was a different proposition. She came in composed, sat in the red leather chair, with the air of someone who has decided to be cooperative, and is confident in that decision. and accepted the offer of coffee with a brief smile. Wolfe asked Fritz to bring it, which is not something he does for everyone. I noted it. "Miss Cosgrove," he began. "I'll dispense with preliminaries. You recognized the name Aldecott when Mr. Goodwin mentioned it. I'd like to know in what context." She was quiet for perhaps 3 seconds. Then, "Cornelius mentioned it. Once, in the last 6 weeks of his life. He was on the phone, the mobile phone which he almost never used, and I walked into the study without knocking, which I occasionally did, and I heard him say, 'The Aldecott matter is more serious than you thought.' He ended the call when he saw me. He was embarrassed." "Did you ask him about it?" "I asked if everything was all right. He said yes. He said it was old business being properly settled." A pause. He was a man who compartmentalized. I knew his rhythms. I didn't push. "Who was he talking to?" "I don't know. I didn't say." "Miss Cosgrove, you recommended the estate lawyer who handled the cremation authorization." She met his gaze steadily. "I recommended the firm I'd been using to manage Cornelius's legal affairs for 4 years. They handled his business correspondence, his contractual matters, several of his estate planning documents. It was a natural recommendation." "Did you know that the cremation would prevent any further medical examination?" "I didn't recommend the cremation," she said, with a precision that was not defensive, but was very deliberate. "I recommended the firm. Philip made the decisions regarding the estate and the arrangements. I was not consulted." "Did you know Gerald Rennick?" "No. Clear, immediate. No processing pause. Genuine, I thought." "I don't know that name." "He was associated with the Aldecott matter. A financial operator." "Then he would predate my involvement with Cornelius. I knew him for 6 years. Whatever the Aldecott matter was, it was older than that." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Miss Cosgrove, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to think carefully before answering. In the last weeks of Cornelius Harrow's life, was there anything, any detail, however small, that seemed anomalous to you? Not suspicious necessarily, simply different from the normal pattern." She was quiet for a longer time than any of her other pauses. Thinking genuinely, I decided. Not managing. "His medication," she said at last. "He had a weekly organizer, one of those pill dispensers, sorted by day and time. He managed it himself, but I occasionally refilled it for him when he was busy, because I knew his prescriptions, and I'd been doing it for years." She paused. 3 weeks before he died, I noticed the organizer had been refilled without my involvement. He told me he'd done it himself, which was possible. He had done it himself before, but it was unusual enough that I noticed. "Did you look at the contents?" "They looked correct. His usual medications. I didn't examine them closely." Her voice was very careful now. "I didn't have a reason to." "No," Wolfe agreed. "You didn't." After she left, Wolfe sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes. I waited. He does his best thinking in silence, and objects to interruptions the way other men object to being shaken awake. "The medication organizer," he said finally. "Someone refilled it who wasn't Vera," I said, "which means either Philip or a third party had access to it. The house, the study, the medication. And the key," Wolfe said. "We still haven't found what the key opens. My contact is still working on the Weissman cabinet trace. Press her." He rose, with the careful deliberateness of a man who weighs what he does. "And tomorrow, Archie, you will go to Connecticut. Rennick." "Rennick." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Archie, Cornelius Harrow was not a sentimental man by his sister's account. He kept records. He was precise. He sent the box to his sister in case of events. He had a key in the box to something he called the relevant documentation." He paused. "He was not careless. Whatever he secured it in a place he considered safe. A place he had controlled for a long time. His office," I said slowly, "or a storage space connected to his business. Something from the publishing years." "From before," Wolfe said. "Before Vera. Before Philip's return. Something old." He went through the door, and I heard him on the stairs. Everything else depends on what's in it. I sat in the quiet office for a while after that, looking at the photograph propped against the bookend. The old man with the military posture, the younger man with the narrow face, the woman turning away, and tried to arrange what I knew into the shape of something that would eventually make sense. We had Philip, who had witnessed fraud and said nothing, who had come back to his father 8 weeks ago at his father's invitation, who had signed a cremation authorization on advice he claimed was innocent. We had Vera, who had overheard a phone call and reported it honestly, who had noticed a medication organizer refilled by someone unknown, who had recommended a law firm she'd been using for years. We had Gerald Rennick in Connecticut, who had run a fraudulent fund and silenced a witness with threats, who connected to Cornelius Harrow through 20 years of professional history. And we had somewhere a cabinet built to order in the mid-1990s with a Weissman lock, containing documentation that a careful man had considered worth dying for, or at any rate, worth anticipating death to preserve. I put on my coat and went out for a walk. Sometimes you need the city's noise to think in. The brownstone is too quiet for certain kinds of thinking, and Wolfe's brain fills up the air in an office the way a large instrument fills a small room. I walked for an hour. When I came back, I had a message from my contact in the security hardware business. The Weissman cabinet had been ordered in 1996 through a dealer in Midtown Manhattan. The dealer's records showed the cabinet had been delivered to an office address on West 47th Street. The offices of Harrow Specialty Publications, Cornelius Harrow's original company. The company no longer existed, but the building did, and I knew someone who could find out what was currently occupying the old suite. I called him, got an answer in 20 minutes, and sat down to write a note for Wolfe's breakfast tray. I had found the cabinet. Gerald Rennick lived in the kind of Connecticut town that exists primarily to demonstrate what money looks like when it stops trying to prove itself. The houses were set back from the roads, behind mature trees. The roads themselves were impeccably maintained, and the whole landscape had the curated quality of a place where even the seasonal changes seemed to occur with good taste and proper timing. I drove up on Saturday morning in the Heron, taking the Merrick Parkway north, in weather that couldn't decide between overcast and gray, and had settled on a compromise that suited neither. I had the address from Saul, a thermos of Fritz's coffee, which I'd requested specifically for the drive, and which Fritz had produced with the quiet dignity of a man who understands that good coffee is infrastructure, and a working theory about how to approach Rennick that I'd spent Friday evening developing. The working theory was simple. Don't approach him as a suspect, approach him as a witness. Men who have spent their lives managing exposure have very refined instincts for threat. Come at Rennick as an antagonist, and he'd have a lawyer on the phone before I finished the first sentence. Come at him as someone seeking context, someone who needed his expertise to understand a dead man's affairs, and there was a chance he'd talk, if only to control the shape of what I heard. It was a theory that depended on Rennick not knowing how much I already knew, which was a gamble, but gamblers who carry good coffee in a thermos tend to feel more optimistic. The house was white clapboard, federal style, with a long front walk and a garden that was in the careful early stages of spring. Things just beginning to come up, nothing fully committed yet. I rang the bell at 10:15 and was answered by Rennick himself, which surprised me. A man of his background usually maintains enough domestic infrastructure to put at least one layer of personnel between himself and unannounced visitors. He was 73, as Saul had said, but the number didn't quite fit the man. He was compact and precisely made, with the posture I'd noticed in the photograph, that deliberate verticality, and the kind of tan that comes from actual weather rather than any artificial source. His face was angular, intelligent, and careful, and his eyes, which were a pale, clear gray, made the assessment of me in the first 2 seconds, and filed the result, without visible conclusion. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. He'd received my card. I'd called ahead, a courtesy I thought might help, and left a message saying I was conducting inquiries into the affairs of the late Cornelius Harrow, and would appreciate a brief conversation. He'd left no response, but he'd answered his own door. "Come in." The interior of the house was orderly and understated. Books, some good furniture, a painting or two that I recognized as the real thing without being able to name the painters. No photographs on display anywhere that I could see, which is a choice rather than an oversight in a house this age. We sat in a study that looked out over the back garden, where a pair of early robins were engaged in some territorial dispute among the newly turned beds. "You said you're looking into Cornelius's affairs," Rennick said. He poured coffee from a carafe without asking. He was that kind of man, I decided, the kind for whom hospitality is control rather than warmth, and set it in front of me. "On whose behalf?" "His sister. She has questions about the circumstances of his death." The police were satisfied it was natural. They were. She isn't. He received this without visible reaction. "And you've come to me because your name appears in documents Cornelius kept. Financial records. You and he had a professional relationship over a number of years." "We did." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "The Aldecott Fund, I imagine." I hadn't said the name. He had. "I filed that." "Among other things," I said. "There were no other things," he said, with the calm of someone who has been precise about this for a long time. "Cornelius and I were involved in one significant joint enterprise, which was the Aldecott Partnership. It ran for 9 years, and was dissolved in 2018 after a period of underperformance. All investors were settled appropriately. There is no outstanding legal matter connected to it." He said this as if reading from a deposition he had memorized, which I suspected was not far from the truth. "The SEC inquiry in 2017 was closed," I said. "It was, because it was baseless." A pause. "Anonymous complaints are sometimes filed by competitors or disgruntled parties. The investigators examined the fund's records and found nothing actionable." "The complaint was withdrawn," I said, "not dismissed." "The distinction is legal semantics," he said. "The outcome was the same." "The person who filed the complaint withdrew it under pressure," I said. I kept my voice conversational, the way Wolfe keeps his. Not accusatory, just interested. That's a different story than a complaint examined and found baseless. For the first time, something moved behind those pale gray eyes. "I don't know who filed the complaint," he said, "and whatever pressure you're imagining is your imagination. Mr. Rennick, I know Philip Harrow filed the complaint. I know he withdrew it. I know why." I watched his face. Nothing dramatic happened to it, which told me he'd known this for some time. What I'm trying to understand is why Cornelius Harrow, 20-plus years after the fact, began investigating the Aldecott matter 6 weeks before his death. The garden robins had settled their dispute. One of them flew away. The other stood on the edge of the turned bed and looked at the ground. "I wasn't aware he was doing that," Rennick said, but his hands had shifted on the cup. "He was. He told someone, we have the record of it, that the Aldecott matter was more serious than he'd thought. Those were his words, more serious than he'd thought. Which implies he'd thought about it before, which implies he knew something, assessed it as manageable, and then found out it wasn't." I paused. "What changed?" Rennick was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence changed character, from evasion to something more complicated. "Cornelius was not an innocent party in the Aldecott arrangement," he said finally. His voice had changed. The deposition quality was gone. He knew what the fund was. He participated in certain structural decisions that required a particular interpretation of the regulations. He chose to participate. At the time, he was satisfied with the returns. Until he wasn't. And then, like many investors who understand exactly what they have been part of, he found retrospective virtue. The bitterness in this was old and carefully contained. He decided he had been wronged. He was not wrong, exactly, but he had not been innocent. And Philip's complaint. Philip saw enough to know the structure was fraudulent. Philip was a junior operative who misunderstood what he was seeing, or understood it correctly and decided to be principled about it, which in the context of the fund's actual operations amounted to the same thing. He looked out at the garden. I persuaded him to withdraw the complaint. I used information he wouldn't want public. It was not my finest hour. You're being remarkably candid, I said. I'm being carefully candid, he corrected. Everything I've told you is either already known or beyond the statute of limitations. I'm not confessing anything actionable. He looked back at me. What I'm doing is telling you that Cornelius Harrow was not the wronged innocent his sister appears to imagine. He was a man with his own ledger of compromises. Maybe, I said, but he's dead. And someone may have killed him. The word killed landed in the room and didn't immediately leave. Natural causes, Rennick said. The medical examiner thought so. The evidence is gone. The body was cremated. I paused. Mr. Rennick, I'm going to ask you something directly. In the last 2 months, did you have contact with anyone connected to Cornelius Harrow's household or personal life? Anyone beyond Cornelius himself? He looked at me for 3 full seconds. No, he said. You're certain? I'm certain. And then, as if he couldn't quite stop himself, why are you asking? Because someone knew enough about Cornelius Harrow's medical condition to exploit it. That knowledge could have come from a medical record, from someone close to him, or from someone with a specific interest in his vulnerability. I let that sit. How well did you know his son? Philip. The name came out flat. I haven't spoken to Philip Harrow in 8 years. We didn't part on terms that invited future conversation. What about Vera Cosgrove? I don't know anyone by that name. I believed him, not because men like Gerald Rennick are reliably honest. In my experience, they're reliably strategic, but because the name produced genuine unfamiliarity rather than managed blankness. Different faces for different lies, and this was the face for a name he simply didn't recognize. One more thing, I said. I took out the photograph, a copy I'd had made before leaving the brownstone, on the grounds that carrying the original into Connecticut seemed incautious, and set it on the table between us. This was in the box Cornelius sent his sister. Rennick looked at it for a moment. Something passed across his face, not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has occasionally wondered whether a certain moment would return to find him, and is now observing its arrival. That was taken at the Whitmore Club, he said. November 2011. It was a dinner celebrating the fund's 3rd-year returns. He pointed to his own image. The older man, the military posture confirmed in person. Then, his finger moved to the younger man. Philip. He was 28 then, I think. And then to the woman, her face turned away. I don't know who she is. I didn't know her. She was there with someone else, and happened to be in the frame. You don't know her at all? No. He looked up from the photograph. Should I? I didn't answer, because I wasn't yet sure. On the drive back down the Merritt, I called Wolfe on the car phone. He dislikes telephone conversations with the intensity usually reserved for moral violations, but will accept them under operational necessity. Rennick confirms the Aldecott arrangement was fraudulent, I said. He admits pressuring Philip. He claims no contact with anyone in Harrow's household or personal life. He doesn't know Vera Cosgrove. And the woman in the photograph? He says he doesn't know her. A bystander, he claims. The silence on the line that I could read as well as a paragraph of text. He's lying, Wolfe said. I thought so too. The everything else was careful honesty, strategic, managed but genuine within its limits. The woman was different. She moved deliberately, Wolfe said. In the photograph, she turned away deliberately. She knew the photograph was being taken and chose not to be in it. I thought the same thing and hadn't articulated it yet, which means she was at the dinner, which means Rennick knew her. Or knew of her, which is more interesting. Wolfe's voice had the particular quality it gets when pieces are assembling in his mind into a shape he can almost see. Come home, Archie. On my way. I paused. One more thing. Rennick said Cornelius wasn't an innocent party in the fund. that he knew what it was and participated willingly until the returns declined. Yes, Wolfe said without surprise. You already thought that. The notebook entries are careful to avoid self-implication. A man documenting potential murder keeps the record clean. But the gaps are visible if you know where to look. A pause. Cornelius Harrow was not exposing a fraud, Archie. He was settling a grievance. There is a difference, and it matters to the question of who wanted him silenced. I thought about that all the way back to the city. My contact in security hardware called while I was sitting in traffic on the FDR Drive, which is the kind of place where bad news arrives with appropriate atmospheric backing. The building on West 47th, she said. The old Harrow Publications suite. It's been leased to a series of tenants since Harrow sold the company in 2001. The current tenant is an architectural firm, but here's the interesting part. The firm's principal told my contact that when they moved in 6 years ago, there was a locked cabinet in the storage room that the previous tenant had left behind. They've been meaning to deal with it for 6 years and haven't. It's still there? Still there. Locked. They tried a locksmith once and he said it was an unusual mechanism and would take time to work on properly, and they lost interest. She paused. It's a Weissman cabinet. They described it to me, and it matches. The cabinet was 6 years old in that office. The architectural firm had been there for 6 years, which meant the cabinet had been there before them, left by the previous tenant, or left by Cornelius Harrow himself when he'd sold the company in 2001 and somehow never reclaimed. Or left there deliberately, in a location only he would think to look for. I called the architectural firm from the car, introduced myself, and asked if I might come by on Monday morning with a key that might open the cabinet. The principal, a pleasant-sounding woman who was clearly tired of looking at an unopenable box in her storage room, said Monday would be fine. I told her I'd be there at 9. Then I sat in traffic and thought about a man who had sent his sister a locked box containing a key to a cabinet he'd left in the offices of a company he'd sold 23 years ago, in case of events. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with the photograph propped in front of him and the notebook open to the final entry. He looked at me as I came in with the expression he gets when he has been waiting for something specific. The cabinet is on West 47th, I said. I'm going Monday morning. Good. Sit down. I sat. Fritz appeared with beer for Wolfe, and on some domestic instinct, a club soda for me. While you were in Connecticut, Wolfe said, I made some inquiries of my own, through channels that do not require me to leave this house. He allowed himself the faintest suggestion of satisfaction at this point. I asked Saul to examine the professional history of Vera Cosgrove. Not her recent history, her earlier history, before she became Cornelius Harrow's assistant. And Vera Cosgrove worked for 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, at a firm called Meridian Administrative Services. Meridian provided back-office support, accounting, record-keeping, investor relations, to a number of specialty investment funds. He paused. One of those funds was Aldecott. I put my club soda down very carefully. She worked for the fund, I said, at the administrative level. She would have had access to records, correspondence, financial reporting. She would have known the structure. He looked at the photograph. She would have known what it was. And then, 3 years after leaving Meridian, she becomes the personal assistant to Cornelius Harrow, who, at the time of her hiring, was not under any investigation and had no apparent reason to be suspicious of her background. Wolfe folded his hands. People compartmentalize their professional histories, Archie. A woman with administrative skills and good references seeking a position with a retired media executive would not automatically be connected to the fund he'd been involved with years earlier. But Cornelius eventually found out. I believe so. I believe that is what he found, what required confirmation in the weeks before his death. He discovered who Vera Cosgrove had been before she came to work for him. And that's what he wanted to tell Philip, I said slowly. What he'd worked out and needed to close properly. I thought about it. Not Rennick, not the fraud itself, Vera. He'd discovered that the woman living in his house, managing his affairs, knowing his medications and his routines and his everything, had come from inside the Aldecott operation. Possibly sent, Wolfe said. The word landed with weight. Sent, I said. By whom? That is the question I cannot yet answer with certainty. He looked at the notebook, but the field has narrowed considerably. Rennick said he doesn't know her. He said he doesn't know anyone by that name, Wolfe said. Administrative staff at a fund operation often work under the knowledge of one partner, but not another. Rennick managed the fund, others benefited from it. Vera Cosgrove may have been known to a partner we haven't yet fully considered. The investors, I said. Cornelius was one. Were there others? Saul is working on the full investor list. We should have it tomorrow. Wolfe rose with the deliberate momentum of a boulder, deciding to move. Dinner in an hour, Archie. Fritz is preparing a cassoulet. I suggest you use the hour to review everything we know about Vera Cosgrove's timeline and look for anomalies. And the woman in the photograph? I asked. Do you know who she is? He stopped in the doorway. I have a conjecture, he said. I want the investor list before I confirm it. And he went through to the hall and up the stairs, leaving me alone with the photograph and the notebook and the particular silence that means Wolfe has seen the shape of something and is waiting for the last piece to make him certain. I looked at the woman in the photograph, half her face turned away, caught in the act of not being seen. I picked up the phone and called Saul. Sunday passed in the particular suspended quality of a day on which important things are being prepared but cannot yet happen. Wolfe spent most of it in the plant rooms with his orchids, which is what he does when he is thinking through a problem at full capacity, and needs his hands occupied with something that requires attention without demanding intelligence. I spent it at my desk, building a timeline. Saul delivered the investor list at 11 in the morning. 12 names on a 2-page document with annotations in his precise handwriting. Brief identifications, current status, any relevant notes. I read through it twice and then brought it to the plant rooms and waited for Wolfe to acknowledge my presence, which took approximately 4 minutes because he was doing something delicate with a Miltoniopsis that apparently required his complete moral attention. The Aldecott investors, I said, when he looked up. 12 limited partners. Cornelius Harrow is number 7. The others are a mixture of retired finance people, 1 or 2 family offices, 2 corporate entities whose ultimate ownership Saul couldn't trace in the time available. I handed him the list. He read it with the rapid completeness of a man who retains everything. Then he stopped. Number 11, he said. I looked at my copy. Number 11 was a family office called the Pemberton Group, described by Saul as vehicle for the personal investments of the family of Nathaniel Drace, deceased 2020, currently administered by his estate. Drace, D.C. could be Philip Castellano, but D.C. could also, I realized, stand for something else entirely. Drace, I said. Nathaniel Drace, Wolfe said, setting the list down and picking up a spray bottle with the calm of a man whose thoughts are moving in an entirely different direction from his hands. Who is deceased, but who had a family that administered his estate, and might have had reason to be interested in Cornelius Harrow's activities regarding the fund that Drace had been an investor in. I thought quickly. If Harrow was starting to dig into Aldecott, if he documented irregularities, that would be a problem for anyone whose money had passed through the fund, especially if the fund's structure had been used to shield certain financial activities from scrutiny. A dead man's estate, Wolfe said thoughtfully, is administered by someone. That someone would have access to all of the financial records connected to the estate, including any ongoing arrangements that derive from the Aldecott period. And if Vera Cosgrove had been placed inside Harrow's household specifically to monitor and manage any threat he posed to those arrangements, then whoever placed her there would be someone with reason to protect the Aldecott structure from posthumous exposure. He set the spray bottle down. Saul could not trace the Drace estate's current administrators? Not in the time he had. He said he could dig further. Ask him to. I called Saul from the plant room phone, which Wolfe tolerates under operational necessity and at no other time. Saul said he'd have something by evening. The cassoulet from Saturday had been, by unanimous household consensus, one of Fritz's seasonal achievements, and he was visibly pleased by the thoroughness with which it had been consumed. Sunday's lunch was a quieter affair, cold ham and a green salad and excellent bread, during which Wolfe and I spoke very little, each occupied with our respective portions of the problem. Over coffee, I laid out the timeline as I'd built it. 2009 to 2018, I said. Cornelius Harrow is a willing participant. Gerald Rennick manages the fund. Nathaniel Drace is a limited partner. The fund is structured in a way that charitably requires a particular interpretation of financial regulations. Philip Castellano, 26, junior staff, sees enough to be troubled, files a complaint, is pressured into withdrawing it. 2011, Wolfe said. The photograph, the Whitmore Club dinner. Aldecott's third-year return celebration. Rennick, Philip, and an unidentified woman who deliberately avoided being photographed. The notation on the back, GR, DC, suggests she was connected to either Rennick or someone with the initials DC. Nathaniel Drace, Wolfe said. If DC in the photograph was not Philip's initials, but Drace's, Nathaniel Drace, or possibly a family member with those initials, then the woman avoided the camera because she was there in connection with Drace, and she had reason to be cautious about her image being associated with the fund. 2014, Wolfe said, picking it up. Vera Cosgrove leaves Meridian Administrative Services. 2017, she appears in Cornelius Harrow's household as his personal assistant. 3 years after leaving the fund-adjacent world, joining the household of one of the fund's principals. Either she sought the position independently, or she was placed there by someone monitoring Harrow's potential as a threat to the Aldecott legacy. 2017 was also the year of the SEC inquiry, I said. The timing is not coincidental. Someone filed a complaint, Philip, anonymously, and whoever had an interest in the fund made two moves simultaneously. They pressured Philip to withdraw, and they placed a monitor inside Harrow's domestic situation. Wolfe nodded slowly. And so for 6 years, Vera Cosgrove managed Cornelius Harrow's affairs, his correspondence, his schedule, his medications, while reporting to someone else. Or not actively reporting, but available. In case he became dangerous. And 6 weeks ago, Wolfe said, he became dangerous. He found out who she was. How, we don't yet know. But he found out, probably through the same private research that had him using his mobile phone and keeping a separate notebook, and he realized that the woman who refilled his medication organizer and read to him in the evenings and knew his medical history in complete detail had come from inside the structure he was investigating. And he was frightened, Wolfe said, not of her necessarily, of what her presence implied. That someone had known, for 6 years, that he might become a problem, and had prepared accordingly. We sat with that for a moment. The medication organizer, I said. 3 weeks before he died, it was refilled by someone other than Vera. She noticed. She told you it seemed unusual. Yes. Wolfe looked at the far wall. Vera Cosgrove told me the truth in this office. I'm nearly certain of it. She was placed in that household, and she managed Harrow's affairs competently, and she became genuinely fond of him. The detail about reading to him in the evenings, the discomfort about the inheritance, all of it has the ring of genuine feeling. He paused, but someone else had access to that house. Someone who knew where the medication organizer was kept, who knew Harrow's cardiac medications, and who had reason to want Harrow dead before he could complete whatever documentation project he had undertaken. Philip, I said. He'd been in the house for a month. Yes. Wolfe's voice was careful. Philip had access, knowledge of his father's medical condition, and a complicated relationship with the Aldecott matter. Not as a victim of the fraud, but as a participant who had lost his nerve. And his father was about to expose him as the person who had filed and withdrawn the SEC complaint. Which, if Cornelius had found documents connecting Philip's involvement, we need the cabinet. Saul called at 7. The Drace estate, he told me, had been administered since Nathaniel Drace's death in 2020 by a fiduciary management firm. But the relevant financial decisions, including several ongoing contractual arrangements that had been inherited from the estate, were handled in consultation with the one surviving family member actively involved in the estate's management. Nathaniel Drace's daughter. Her name was Diana Cosgrove. She had taken her mother's name after her parents' divorce in 2004. She was 38 years old. I sat down in my chair. Saul, I said. I know, he said. Vera Cosgrove is Diana Drace, Nathaniel Drace's daughter, Saul confirmed, which makes her a beneficial heir to the Drace portion of the Aldecott partnership, which means she has a direct financial interest in preventing any posthumous examination of the fund's structure. But she also has 1/3 of Cornelius Harrow's estate, I said, because he put her in his will. Which she didn't seek, Saul said, according to what she told Wolfe. According to what she told Wolfe, I agreed, which may be entirely true, a woman who was placed in a dead man's household at her father's behest, who spent 6 years doing a job competently and developed genuine affection for her employer, who was left 1/3 of his estate because he was a man who expressed affection through financial instruments. I stopped. She didn't kill him, Saul. No, Saul said, I don't think she did either. But she knows who did. A pause. That, Saul said, I couldn't say. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the evening quiet of the office. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. From somewhere in the house, I could hear Fritz moving in the kitchen. The small domestic sounds of a household maintaining its equilibrium, regardless of what was happening in the rooms where the thinking happened. I went upstairs and knocked on the door of the plant rooms. Wolfe was at the potting bench, his large hands surprisingly delicate with a small yellow cattleya. He looked at me and read my face. Tell me, he said. I told him, all of it. Vera Cosgrove as Diana Drace, Nathaniel Drace's daughter, the Aldecott inheritance, the placement in Harrow's household. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, still holding the orchid with great care. She told me the truth, he said. Everything she told me in this office was accurate. She does know the name Aldecott. She knows it from her father's estate. She did overhear Cornelius on the phone. She did notice the medication organizer. She was genuinely fond of him. He set the orchid down, but she did not volunteer who she was or why she was there, which is the shape of a truth designed to function as a lie. She's protecting someone, I said. She knows what happened. She may know who did it, but she's not saying. Because the person she's protecting, Wolfe said, is connected to her more closely than Cornelius Harrow's killer. He walked to the window of the plant room and looked out at the Manhattan rooftops in the evening light. From this height, you can see the geometry of the city more clearly than from the street, the order underlying the apparent chaos. Tomorrow you'll go to West 47th Street, he said. You'll open the cabinet. And then I'll ask everyone to come here, all of them, together. He turned from the window. I have the shape of it, Archie. What's in that cabinet will give it to me. He went back to his cattleya. I went downstairs and poured myself a drink and sat in the office alone, looking at the photograph, the notebook, and the rosewood box with its green felt and its now absent key. In case of events, Cornelius Harrow had written. The events had come. We were catching up to them. The architectural firm occupied what had once been a full floor of a midtown building and had been subdivided, over the decades, into a series of offices sharing a central hallway and a kitchenette that nobody was entirely happy about. The firm itself, Pellegrino and Associates, according to the etched glass on the entrance, had 3 rooms and a storage area. And the principal, a tall woman named Clara Pellegrino, who had the organized energy of someone for whom every square foot of space has a planned function, met me at the door at 9 o'clock, with the expression of a woman who is genuinely curious about what's been in her storage room for 6 years. "We did try to have it removed once," she said, leading me down the hall. "But it weighs approximately 400 pounds, and no one could establish clear ownership, and the locksmith quoted us $300 to work on the mechanism, and we decided we had better things to spend $300 on." She opened the storage room door. There it is. There it was. It was a mahogany cabinet, approximately 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, with brass fittings and a lock plate of a design I recognized from my contact's description. It had the weight and solidity of something built to last past its owner's interest in it, which was exactly what had happened. The surface was dusty, and there was a small scratch on the left side that looked old, but the structure was sound. I took out the key. The Weissman lock accepted it on the first try, with the satisfying solidity of a mechanism that has been waiting to perform its function for a long time. Clara Pellegrino watched from the doorway as I opened the cabinet. The top 2 held hanging file folders, neatly organized and labeled in a small, precise hand. The bottom shelf held 3 additional items: a sealed manila envelope, a flash drive in a clear plastic case, and a bound ledger approximately 2 inches thick. I stood there for a moment, looking at 23 years of waiting. Then I took out a pair of latex gloves, the good habit of a man who has worked with Nero Wolfe for over a decade, put them on, and began to examine the contents. I won't reproduce the documentation in full, partly because much of it was technical financial material that would require its own chapter to explain, and partly because Wolfe would be better at the explanation anyway. What I can say is that over the next 2 hours, sitting on a folding chair that Clara Pellegrino thoughtfully produced, I read through enough material to understand the broad architecture of what Cornelius Harrow had assembled. The file folders contained records from the Aldecott partnership, the real records, not the official ones. Parallel accounting, double sets of investor statements, documentation of funds routed through the Drace family's Pemberton Group vehicle in ways that obscured their origin and destination. There were correspondence records between Rennick and Nathaniel Drace, who had, it became clear, been not merely a limited partner, but an active architect of the fund's more questionable structures. Drace had been the intelligence behind it. Rennick had been the face. The ledger was Cornelius Harrow's own work, a meticulous cross-referencing of the official records against the real ones, compiled over what must have been years of patient assembly. He hadn't been assembling this in the last 6 weeks, I realized. He'd been doing it for much longer. The last 6 weeks were simply when he'd found the final piece. The manila envelope contained one document, typed and signed, a statement by Cornelius Harrow, dated 2 weeks before his death, attesting to the nature and contents of the cabinet and his own role in and knowledge of the fund's operations. He didn't spare himself. He acknowledged his participation. He named his sources for each piece of documentation. He noted that he had been for many years a willing beneficiary of an arrangement he now understood to be substantially fraudulent, and that his motivation for creating the record was partly reparative and partly, he wrote with the candor of a man writing for posterity, to ensure that if anything happened to him, the record would exist. He knew, I thought. He knew what he was risking, and he chose to do it anyway, and he tried to make it count. The flash drive I would look at later, on my laptop, with Wolfe. I photographed everything with my phone, every document, every page of the ledger, every folder label, before putting everything back and locking the cabinet. I arranged with Clara Pellegrino to have the cabinet transferred to a secure storage facility that afternoon. Gave her the number of a firm Wolfe uses for exactly this kind of situation, and walked out into the Monday morning midtown noise, feeling the particular heaviness that comes for reading a dead man's prepared statement. Wolfe read the photographic record on my laptop without interruption, scrolling with one finger, in a manner suggesting that he had recently and reluctantly made peace with the existence of touchscreens. Occasionally he stopped and enlarged something. Twice he asked me to read a passage aloud so he could close his eyes and process it without the screen. When he finished, he sat back. "The Drace family," he said. "Nathaniel Drace was the architect. Rennick was the instrument. Cornelius Harrow was, as he acknowledges himself, a knowing participant who chose retrospective virtue when the returns declined and the risk calculus changed. And Vera Cosgrove, Diana Drace, was placed in his household 6 years ago, at a time when the Aldecott matter was still sensitive. Her father was still alive then, 2017. Her father died in 2020, after which she became the administrator of the estate's financial interests, including the ongoing arrangements that the Aldecott structure had shielded." Wolfe looked at the window. She would have had both the motivation and the means to know when Harrow became dangerous, when he began his private research. "But she didn't kill him," I said. "The medication organizer was refilled by someone who'd been in the house less than a month. Philip had been there for a month." "Yes." Wolfe was quiet for a moment. "And Philip's situation is more complicated than either innocence or guilt in the simple senses. He came back because his father called him. His father called him because he wanted to make amends, and because, I think, he wanted a witness. Someone who knew the Aldecott history and could confirm the record's integrity." He paused. "But Philip also has his own complicated relationship with the fund. His own involvement that he'd suppressed for years." "You think someone used that?" I said. "I think someone who knew both Philip's history and his father's intentions was in a position to make Philip a choice." He turned to look at me directly. "Vera Cosgrove knew both. She had been in that house for 6 years. She knew Philip's history. It would be in the administrative records she'd have accessed. She knew his father's intentions because she was watching." "Are you saying she recruited Philip? That she approached him and—" "I'm saying the alternative. That Philip independently decided to kill his father, with precise pharmacological knowledge, in a manner indistinguishable from natural causes, requires Philip to have capabilities and knowledge he may not possess." Wolfe looked at his hands. "Vera Cosgrove worked for 3 years in fund administration. She would know that certain medications, combined with Cornelius's own prescription protocol, could produce the effect we're considering. She would have known how. She may have provided that knowledge to someone who had the access." "And the cremation," I said, "recommended by Vera's law firm, authorized by Philip." He shook his head slowly. "Whether by design or opportunism, the result was the same. The physical evidence was destroyed." I sat with that for a moment. "She was fond of him," I said. "You said so yourself. She spent 6 years with the man. She read to him. She was uncomfortable about the inheritance." "Yes," Wolfe said, "and that is the most painful part of this. I don't believe she wanted him dead. I believe she found herself in a situation where she had information, knowledge of how it could be done, and someone she cared about more than Cornelius Harrow was in danger. Not physical danger, perhaps, legal danger, financial danger, the destruction of something she valued." He paused. "Philip Harrow. She had lived in that house for 6 years with a man who was by several accounts difficult and remote, and she had watched his son, the returning son, the complicated son, come back and try to reconnect with a father who was simultaneously trying to prepare his own legacy. And she had feelings about Philip that were perhaps not administrative. She protected him," I said. "She gave him what he needed and then protected him. And now she is sitting with both the inheritance she didn't want and the knowledge of what it cost." He rose. "Call them all, Archie. Elspeth Harrow, Philip Harrow, Vera Cosgrove, and get me Gerald Rennisk's number as well. I want him on the telephone, at least, if not in person." "When?" "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock." He moved toward the door. "I need 1 day to confirm the final element. One thing I am inferring rather than knowing, and I prefer to know." "What's the final element?" He stopped in the doorway. "Whether Philip Harrow understood what he was being given," Wolfe said, "or whether he believed it was simply a different medication." There is a difference, not legally perhaps, but morally, and I want to be precise when I speak tomorrow. He went to dinner. I sat in the office for a while longer, thinking about a woman who had turned away from a camera in 2011, and a man who had spent 6 years hoping his father would call, and the particular tragedy of people who arrive at catastrophic decisions through entirely comprehensible paths. Then I picked up the phone and started making calls. They came at 7. Elspeth Harrow came first, at 6:55, punctuality being among her virtues. She sat in the red leather chair and declined tea with the brevity of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks, and doesn't want it interrupted by logistics. Philip Harrow arrived at 7 precisely, saw his aunt, and chose the chair nearest the door. Not obviously, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a man sits in the position with the clearest exit without quite knowing why. He looked composed and tired, which is a combination I've seen before in people who have been managing something heavy for a sustained period. Vera Cosgrove came in at 3 minutes past 7, and the room changed in the subtle way that rooms change when the person who matters most to what's about to happen walks into them. She saw Philip first, and something moved in her face. Not guilt exactly, not alarm, but a kind of resignation, the expression of someone who has known this room was inevitable, and has arrived at it. Then she saw Elspeth, and composed herself and took the chair on the far side, equidistant from both. I had Gerald Rennick on the speakerphone, having called him at 5, and told him that Nero Wolfe had concluded his investigation, and that his participation in the final conversation was advisable. He hadn't objected, which told me he'd spent the last 2 days doing his own calculations, and had arrived at the conclusion that managed exposure was better than surprised exposure. Wolfe came in at 7:07, which is typical of him. He believes that punctuality is a form of anxiety, and that a man sufficiently confident in his conclusions can afford to arrive when he's ready. He settled into his chair, looked at the assembled faces with the thoroughness of a man taking inventory, and folded his hands. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll be direct, because the evidence is substantial, and the reasoning is complete, and directness is more respectful than theater." He looked at Elspeth. "Your brother was murdered, Mrs. Harrow. I am satisfied of this, though the physical proof is circumstantial, the body having been cremated before the relevant testing could be conducted. I'll explain what happened and by whom, and then I'll explain what can and cannot be done about it." The room was very quiet. Even through the phone speaker I could hear Rennick's careful breathing. Cornelius Harrow died of cardiac arrest induced by an acute potassium spike, almost certainly achieved through the introduction of a modified preparation into his medication organizer, timed to interact with his existing cardiac medications, and produce an event that would read as a natural consequence of his underlying condition. He paused. This required specific medical and pharmacological knowledge, access to his medication organizer, and sufficient understanding of his cardiac history to calibrate the preparation with some precision. He looked at Philip Harrow. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "you had been in your father's house for approximately 1 month at the time of his death. You had access to every room, including the study where the medication organizer was kept. You knew your father's medical history. Vera Cosgrove noticed that 3 weeks before your father died, the organizer had been refilled by someone other than herself. That someone was almost certainly you." Philip was very still. He looked at Wolfe with the composure of a man who has been waiting for a sentence and is determined to receive it standing. "However," Wolfe said, "I do not believe you understood precisely what you were doing." The stillness broke slightly. "I don't," he began. "Let me finish." Wolfe's voice was firm but not unkind. "Vera Cosgrove, whose name at birth was Diana Drace, and whose father was one of the principal architects of the Aldecott Fund, provided you with what she described, I believe, as a supplement. something to support your father's cardiac health. She gave you the preparation and told you where it was to be placed. She told you it was something his cardiologist had recommended, or something similar, a plausible explanation that you, under the circumstances of your complicated relationship with your father, accepted without excessive scrutiny. He looked at Vera Cosgrove. You knew what it was, he said. You understood the pharmacology. You had the knowledge from 6 years of managing a man's medical life in close detail, combined with whatever you researched in the weeks after your father's death, when you became the administrator of his estate, and reviewed the financial history that made Cornelius Harrow's documentation project a threat to your interests. He paused. You also knew that if your employer completed his project and submitted his documentation to the relevant authorities, the ongoing arrangements that had been shielded by the Aldecott structure, and which constituted a significant portion of your inheritance from your father, would be exposed. And that Philip Harrow's own compromised history with the fund, including his anonymous complaint and its withdrawal, would become public. You used what you felt for him, I said from my desk. Vera looked at me. Philip, you found someone who had motivation and access, and you gave him a reason and a means, and you made sure he didn't understand what he was doing. Her face was composed. She was not going to cry, I thought, and she was not going to deny it, and she was not going to perform anything. She sat in her chair, with the still quality of someone who has moved past the question of whether this moment would come, and is now simply present in it. The medication organizer, Wolfe continued, was refilled by Philip, who believed he was helping his father. The preparation, he added, was supplied by Vera Cosgrove, who understood its effects. 3 weeks later, Cornelius Harrow died of what appeared to be a natural cardiac event. He looked at Rennick's phone on the side table. Mr. Rennick, you were not directly involved in the death. You are, however, implicated in the fraudulent structure of the Aldecott Fund, and the documentation in Cornelius Harrow's cabinet is comprehensive. That is a separate matter for other authorities. Understood, Rennick said through the speaker. His voice was careful and flattened. Philip, Elspeth said. She said it very quietly, looking at her nephew with the expression of a woman doing the arithmetic of a terrible discovery. Philip turned to look at her. I didn't know, he said, and for the first time all evening his composure was not managed. It was simply present, the composure of genuine shock, wearing out its welcome after 3 weeks of slow, growing understanding. I didn't know what it was. She said it was a supplement. She said his cardiologist. He stopped. He looked at Vera. You told me it would help him. Vera Cosgrove looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. It was barely audible. I'm sorry. Sorry, he said. I know that doesn't. She stopped. I know. The room held that for a moment. Wolfe did not interrupt it. He has impeccable timing in the direction of silence. There is the question, Wolfe said finally, of what is now to be done. The physical evidence is gone. What remains is testimonial. Vera Cosgrove's own knowledge, Philip Harrow's account of receiving and placing the preparation, and the documentary evidence in the cabinet, which establishes motive and context, comprehensively, but not direct proof of the act. He looked at Elspeth. You asked me what happened. I have told you. Whether the law can be made to confirm what I know is a separate question, and one for which you will need a lawyer of rather specific capabilities. The cabinet documents, I said. The SEC, at a minimum, and the relevant prosecutors in the appropriate jurisdictions can make their own determinations about the testimony. He looked at Vera Cosgrove. Miss Cosgrove, I will tell you, as I told your employer when he assembled his documentation, that forthright cooperation with what comes next is both the ethically correct position and the practically advantageous one. The distinction between the person who devised and provided the means and the person who administered it in ignorance is meaningful, both morally and legally. Vera looked at him. You're telling me to confess. I'm telling you what I know to be true. What you do with it is your own decision. He unfolded his hands. I have answered your question, Mrs. Harrow. I am sorry for the nature of the answer. Elspeth sat with the rosewood box in her lap. She had brought it, I'd noticed, as she had brought it the first time, holding it the way people hold things that belong to someone they've lost. He knew it was coming, she said. He suspected, Wolfe said. He was not certain. He did what he could. It wasn't enough. No, Wolfe said, it wasn't. But it was not nothing. You're here. The record exists. The truth is known. He paused. These are not small things. They filtered out over the next 20 minutes. Rennick disconnected from the phone with 3 quiet words. Philip left with his aunt, and I watched from the door as they stood on the brownstone steps briefly. Elspeth saying something I couldn't hear. Philip listening with the particular attention of a man receiving information he has no immediate capacity to process. Vera Cosgrove left last. She stopped at the office door and looked back at Wolfe, who was examining the day's mail with the air of a man who has returned from somewhere and is reacquainting himself with his ordinary life. He was a good man, she said. Whatever he'd done before, at the end he was trying to be a good man. Wolfe looked up. Most people are, he said. At the end, trying. The quality of the effort varies. His was genuine. She nodded once and went. Fritz served a late supper at 9, simple by his standards, which meant only extraordinary by anyone else's. And afterward, I sat in the office with the last of my coffee and the rosewood box, which Elspeth had left behind, with the same absence of explanation her brother had used when he sent it to her. In case of events. The events had been. They hadn't resolved cleanly, because events involving real people rarely do. The district attorney's office would make its own determinations about what could be proven, and what could be charged, and what would eventually stick. Philip Harrow had not understood what he'd done, but had done it. Vera Cosgrove had understood exactly, and had used someone's ignorance and grief as her instrument, which is among the more sophisticated forms of cruelty, because it distributes the harm in ways that are difficult to trace and impossible to take back. And somewhere in Connecticut, Gerald Rennick was calling his lawyer, which had probably been happening since before Wolfe finished his 3rd sentence. "Wolfe," I said. He was in his chair with his book. He looked up. "She was in love with him," I said. "Vera, with Philip." "Yes," he said. "I think so. So she killed the one to protect the other." "And destroyed both in the process," he said, "as that particular choice generally does." I thought about Cornelius Harrow, reading alone in his study at 2 in the morning, a book in his lap, working out what he suspected, sending a box to his sister without explanation, because he didn't know how much time he had, and wanted to use what there was. He knew she was watching him, I said. He couldn't approach the documentation directly. She'd know. So he used the mobile phone, kept the notebook, built the cabinet record years before, and kept the key somewhere she'd never look. "In the box," Wolfe said, with the photograph he'd kept all those years. Gr, DC, Rennick, and Drace, the 2 men who had built the structure that had used him. And somewhere at the edge of the frame, the daughter of one of them, caught in the act of not being seen. He looked at his book without opening it. He had suspected for some time who she was. It took him until the end to confirm it. When he did, he called Philip, and she knew what it meant. And she made her choice, Wolfe said, with the measured finality of a man who has explained all that can be explained and is willing to leave the rest to its own weight. He opened his book. I sat with the rosewood box in the lamplit office, and outside, New York went about its ordinary late-evening life. Taxis, and voices, and the distant percussion of a city that doesn't pause for private grief. And I thought about the particular stubbornness of truth, which is that it doesn't go away when it's inconvenient, and doesn't arrive on schedule when it's needed, and mostly exists somewhere between those 2 failures, waiting for someone careful enough to find it. Cornelius Harrow had been careful enough. A little late, a little compromised, but genuinely careful when it counted. It seemed worth noting. I put the box on the shelf, finished my coffee, and called it a night. Wolfe turned a page. The orchids, 3 floors above us in the dark, bloomed without anyone watching.